Hello, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. This is Anthony DeSimone producing his 5th edition of Penguins Pointers. So, to look at last night's game where the Penguins were able to edge out a win against the Minnesota Wild by the score of 4-3. The shot department was equal at 29. The hits were pretty up there in the numbers, eating into low 30s for both teams. Faceoffs, for the most part, were consistently equal until we got to the third period, where Minnesota seemed to get an edge and finished with 37 wins to the Penguins' 29 faceoff wins. And the power plays both struck. The Minnesota Wild went 2 for 6, as did the Penguins. The story of the night, despite the win, was Malkin's 4-point night. He had 2 goals and 2 assists, and one of the goals was probably one of the more beautiful goals you've seen in Evgeny Malkin's career. And I do encourage you guys, if you can get a chance to check out those highlights, do check it out. It was a very pretty goal. Looking at last night's performance, some of my thoughts from then. A strong response to the Devils' loss. As we all know, fans, players, coaches, and probably even some of the staff were really frustrated with the lack of performance by the Penguins in the New Jersey Devil game, a game where we lost 4-0, and just as the game went on, they looked worse and worse as the period went on. After the game, it was reported they had a closed-door meeting where some of the players said they were vocal toward each other, understanding that they are a family, but they said some things. I believe Pascal Dupuis talked about some things just needed to be said. Evgeny Malkin also was quoted on a couple things saying, we need to have a better team effort on the ice and matters such as that. And I think it was just that 4-0 loss to the Devils was a wake-up call for them. For the most part, they were kind of going through the season just through the motions. They were a 10-6 hockey club, 10-7 after the loss. And they were just kind of playing like a 500 hockey team. They'd have a couple good nights, strung out a really good win against the Canadiens, and then they would just go quiet. There wouldn't be a good performance from them, and I think that needed to be addressed, and they needed to say, hey, we're a competitive hockey team, we're a strong-knit group, and we need to play like one. I can almost guarantee you, aside from some other word choices, that was pretty much what was said in that closed-door meeting. But like I said, that was a really strong response after the Devils' loss a few nights ago. What I liked about this game against the Wild was they understood the style of Minnesota and incorporated it into their playing style. Now, what I mean by that is they brought a hard, physical, and offensive approach to this game, which is a little different than what they normally bring in terms of defensive strategies. They were hitting, a lot of players were getting some good hits on the boards. Speaking of boards, a lot of grinding on those boards in the corners, a lot of tough plays, a lot of stick poke checks, good tactics like that, and they were offensive. They were able to get 4 goals against the Wild, understanding that Marc-Andre Fleury does not have a good record against the Wild. The team recognized that and needed to ensure that they had enough goals to beat him. In case you're wondering, Fleury's goals against average against the Minnesota Wild is somewhere in the medium 3 goals against. I think it's like 343, which is one of his worst statistics against any team in the NHL. So the Minnesota Wild kind of have his number a little bit, and that's probably why they got 3 goals up against him last night. Aside from that, though, I like the change. You have to switch up every once in a while. Yes, you can be a defensive team, but every once in a while you kind of have to flex your muscles and put those goals out there. And I think the Penguins set the tone really well in the first period, getting that goal early with David Perron getting his 2nd goal of the season. And they set the tone saying, we're going to play a fast-paced, hard-hitting hockey game. And I think that's kind of what propelled them to play a full 60 minutes. They maintained energy pretty well despite some of the comeback attempts by the Minnesota Wild. And I felt like they played a really good hockey game, especially after the Devils game. It was just a completely 180 turnaround from that game. As I said earlier, Malkin delivered. He was frustrated. Everybody knew that. He came out on the ice, channeled his frustration, had a couple beautiful plays, and ended up getting 2 goals and 2 assists last night to really help his team get that win last night. And I was glad to see him do that. He just seemed to be... It looked like he lost 10 to 15 pounds, and he was just skating around so fast, and his stick handling was really well. And another thing to note is Sidney Crosby was playing around with some of the players, too, last night in terms of stick handling, especially behind Dubnyk, the Minnesota Wild goaltender. He was really playing some good stick handling, and I think that kind of contributed to the offensive strategy that they had, because the Penguins saw that Malkin and Crosby and a couple other big players such as Kessel were on their game, and they were able to speed their pace up a little bit based on that. So with those big star players delivering like they did last night, I think the Penguins got that little bit of an extra edge, which propelled them to the win. The power play. Yes, it is the worst in the National Hockey League. But thank the Lord, the first power play was not good at all. They were maybe in the offensive zone about 15 seconds on that power play, and the fans harked at them pretty good. There was a good 2 to 3 second boo session after that penalty ended. But after that, the Penguins kind of hammered down, figured out a strategy that worked against Minnesota, and were able to get 2 power play goals last night. So the power play did have some response. It's still going to need a lot of work. I still think that power play is atrocious and sloppy. Their entrances could be a lot better, and I just feel like when they get to the blue line in the offensive zone, they all just kind of stand around and go, okay, so who's bringing it in? And the next thing they do, they either dump it in weakly and it gets thrown back out, or they try to go around the boards and there's no one on the other side to receive the puck, so it's a free clear for the defensive team. So I think they still need to work on that. Other than that, the penalty kill last night went 4 for 6. Could have been a little better there, but considering Marc-Andre Fleury's track record with the Minnesota Wild, I kind of expected them to get a couple power play goals against us, so not really disappointed there. Our penalty kill is still a really good penalty kill this season. Lastly, I'm sure we'll be getting some more information about this, but Ole Mata's injury, if you didn't watch the game last night, you can look at the replay. I recommend, if you're a little squeamish about this kind of stuff, don't look at it. But basically what happened was Ole Mata was making a play in the offensive zone with the puck and dropped it off to another Minnesota Wild player that had poke checked him off his stick, and he was turning around just to go to the bench, and a player from the Minnesota Wild essentially shoved him while he was angling his body to make a tight turn, and in doing so he lost his edge on his skate and went barreling into the boards by the bench. The impact of the collision between him and the boards actually knocked the door for the players on the Minnesota bench open, and I think what happened was, we'll find out more once the medical injury report comes out, something either with his right hip or his right arm, because he was down, and I mean, he tried to get up, but he was down, and I believe it took the trainer, some staff, and Pascal Dupuis to get him off the ice, as he was very, very tentative to his right side. I'm not sure if maybe he dislocated a shoulder or if he had popped something with his hip, something along those lines, but I do caution you, if you watch that video, it is a very aggressive hit into the boards, so watch that with caution. So hopefully the injury won't be too substantial for Ole Mata, as he's a wonderful player, a great young athlete, and I hope to see him back on the ice for the Penguins, because he is a great asset to the defensive unit of the Penguins. So transitioning over to last night's win and what it did to the standings. These standings are, of course, updated as of Tuesday night at 11 p.m. The New York Rangers still hold the top spot, have 14 wins on the season with 30 points. Capitals and Islanders are 7 points back with 23. The Penguins, after their win, will pull themselves over top of the Devils once again with 22. And if you skip down past the Devils, Flyers, and Hurricanes, watch out for the Columbus Blue Jackets. They've won 3 in a row, and all of a sudden are back into the picture here at 7-12. Need I remind you, they started 0-8 in the season and have since gone 7-4 in their last 11 to pull themselves back into the standings here in the Metropolitan Division. So keep an eye out on Columbus and see where they go. So not necessarily counting out that 0-8 team so early in the season. That's kind of what I was talking about with, yes, the Devils' loss was bad, but once again, it was just a loss, and so much can happen. And that's a perfect example, is Columbus was starting out awfully at 0-8, and they were left in the dust, and they have now pulled back to tied for 7th place with Philadelphia next in line. So you can't disparage and knock teams out of the standings immediately, and you can't take every loss in the first 20 to 30 games of the season as detrimental. With that, if you guys recall earlier in this blog series I had talked about, let's talk about the Penguins' performance when we get 20 to 30 games in. And I'll probably start to address that in my next blog or two, but currently I'm fine with a record of 11-7. They're in the middle of the pack. They're still not too far away from the Rangers, but at the same time they are a little close to the bottom of the standings, but there's nothing wrong with being in the middle of the pack. 11-7 in my opinion is a decent record for your first 18 games, and I expect them to play about that record, and they'll still be in contention to get up there in the Metropolitan standings once we hear the whereabouts of Ole Mata, and hopefully once we fix this power play, we can maybe get a couple extra wins. But I think they're starting to catch their niche, their style of play, and with that, I do believe that they'll hang around in the top 4 spots for most of the season, in my opinion. I don't see them falling down to the bottom half of the standings at all this season. The only thing that I think would cause that is if we have a substantial amount of major injuries that require us to pull out of Wilkes-Barre. But I think if players stay healthy this season, then I think we shouldn't have a problem staying in that top 4 section of the Metropolitan Division. Speaking of games, the next game coming up is going to be Thursday night in Pittsburgh. The Colorado Avalanche will be making their way across the country to face off against the Pittsburgh Penguins. Colorado, don't let their record fool you. They had a 3-game winning streak. They were 4-10-1. Now they're 7-10-1. And that, of course, is as of Tuesday at 11 p.m. But they have improved. They had a nice stretch of 3 games here, so they'll be walking into Pittsburgh looking to see if they can knock the Penguins off and keep their winning streak going. So we'll have to look out for that. Colorado's a tough team to look at. They had some restructuring over the past couple seasons. They're a developing hockey team, but that does not mean they will be a pushover. Developing hockey teams are usually the teams that surprise teams like the Pittsburgh Penguins and come in and steal a win because you don't know what to expect with them. So my thought is we go back to not the offensive style we had against the Minnesota Wild, but instead we transition back to that defensive style for this game. Give Fleury a little more protection in front of the net. Try not to take as many penalties. And play more of a slightly more conservative style. We know we have players that can score, and the game tonight showed that. Between Malkin and Crosby, Perron, we know we have the talent. Now what we need to do is be smart about the talent. Know when to use it, know when to score, and know when is a smart time to take a chance versus the consequence of that chance being they get a breakaway the other way. I feel personally, considering the Penguins' power play is still not up to par, we stick with a conservative strategy because then that guarantees that at least we're not giving up 4 or 5 goals a night like we did in New Jersey and we look pitiful. At least here, if Fleury's kept only giving up 1 or 2 goals, we're still in the hockey game even though we go to the third period and maybe we aren't playing our best game. 2 goals isn't that hard to overcome, whereas a 4-0 deficit is almost insurmountable in the NHL anymore, considering how good the goalies have gotten in the past couple years. So, keeping that in mind, look forward to seeing them face off against the Colorado Avalanche Thursday. But as for now, that is the end of this podcast. I want to thank you all for listening in. Hope you liked what I was talking about tonight, and if you do, please hit that like button down below. And if you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe, and I will have one of these up probably next week. But until then, see you guys, and thanks for listening. Go Pens.